Picture this. You're standing on wet sand somewhere off the coast of northern England, and there's almost a mile of open mudflat between you and the only safe place left in the country. The tide's coming back in about 40 minutes. You've got a kid with you, and somewhere behind you in the trees past the marsh, something that used to be a person is starting to notice you're there. Not a jump scare, not a horde, just a clock and water, and the fact that you have to time your own survival down to the minute, or the ocean kills you before the infected ever get the chance. This is why you wouldn't survive 28 years later, and I want to be upfront about something before we start. This isn't really a zombie movie in the way Walking Dead fans or Dawn of the Dead fans are used to. There's no CDC lab, no military convoy rolling in to save the day, no slow creeping outbreak you watch unfold city by city. By the time the story starts, the apocalypse is old news. It happened, it got contained, the rest of the world moved on, and everyone left on this island has spent almost 3 decades just living with it. That's a different kind of horror, and it's the kind that honestly hits closer to home than people expect. Let's get into it. So here's the setup, and I need you to really sit with how insane this premise is once you think about it. The Rage virus breaks out, spreads through the UK, and instead of the whole planet going down like in World War Z, the rest of the world actually manages to contain it. Europe gets hit a little. The virus reaches Paris on a second wave, and then it gets stamped out everywhere except the British Isles. The entire country gets sealed off. NATO ships patrol the water. Nobody goes in, nobody comes out, and that quarantine line just stays there for 28 years. Now imagine that happening here. Imagine if, say, the entire state of Florida got hit with something like this back during COVID. And instead of the National Guard and FEMA flooding in to fix it, the federal government just looked at the satellite photos, said, yeah, that's a lost cause, and put a naval blockade around the whole peninsula. No supply drops, no evacuation flights, no rescue, just abandon it and quarantine it, and let whoever's still alive in there figure it out on their own indefinitely. That's the world of this movie. Britain didn't get rebuilt, Britain got written off, and the people who survived didn't get a FEMA camp or a refugee convoy. They got nothing. So they did what people in places like the Smoky Mountains or rural Appalachia have always known how to do when the supply chain disappears completely. They went backward, way backward. The community we meet, Lindisfarne, also called Holy Island, isn't some fortified compound with generators and stockpiled ammo. It's a fishing and farming village running on 1950s technology. Candles, hand tools, bows and arrows instead of guns, because here's the thing that should genuinely unsettle an American watching this. 28 years with no resupply means 28 years with no new bullets. The guns ran dry decades ago. Whatever ammo existed got used up in the first few years of the outbreak, and after that, it's gone. No factories, no Cabela's, no gun show down the road. You go back to a recurve bow and a quiver of hand-fletched arrows because that's a weapon you can actually keep making forever. Think about how much that one detail changes everything. We grew up on Walking Dead, where Rick's still finding ammo in pickup trucks 6 seasons in. We grew up on Zombieland, where Woody Harrelson's got a trunk full of guns. This is the opposite. This is what survival actually looks like once the firearms run out for good, and it forces this community into something closer to medieval siege logic than modern American prepper logic. And the thing protecting Lindisfarne isn't a wall or a checkpoint or armed guards, it's a tide table. The island connects to the mainland by a causeway, a strip of land that's only exposed at low tide. Get the timing right and you can walk across. Get it wrong and the North Sea comes back in and either drowns you on the sand or strands you overnight on the mainland with everything that's hunting in the dark. Now let's talk about the actual hunt, because this is where the film starts showing you what's really out there. Jamie takes his 12-year-old son Spike across the causeway for a coming-of-age ritual, his first kill on the mainland, basically his version of a first hunting trip with dad, except instead of deer season in rural Texas, the targets used to be human beings. And the first thing they run into in the forest are what the community calls slow lows. These things are bloated, pale, crawling along the forest forest floor on their stomachs because somewhere in the last 28 years, the virus mutated into a version that just stopped expending energy. They eat worms and grubs and whatever rots on the ground. They're slow, they're easy, and Jamie walks Spike right up to one and hasn't put an arrow through it like it's target practice. This is the equivalent of taking your kid out for their first squirrel before you ever hand them a rifle for deer. Low stakes, low risk, designed to build confidence, but don't get comfortable because the movie's entire structure is built around showing you the easy kill first and then yanking the rug out. The real threat in this forest is something called an alpha, and when you see one, you understand immediately why the bow and arrow lifestyle of this community is genuinely terrifying instead of quaint. Jamie tells Spike the virus hit some of the infected like steroids, and I mean that almost literally. These things are massive, fast, strong enough that when they catch you, they don't just bite. They grab your head and your spine and tear them straight out of your body in one motion, like they're field dressing a deer. There's a soldier in this film who gets that exact treatment, and it is one of the single most brutal kills I've ever watched in this genre. Worse than anything in Dawn of the Dead. Worse than the church scene in 28 Days Later. Arrows barely slow an alpha down. Jamie and Spike pump one full of shots into the one chasing them, and it just keeps coming. Fire seems to be the most effective option this community has against them. When the chase finally reaches Lindisfarne's gate, it's a flaming projectile from the Watchman, not another arrow that finally drops it. Think about that for a second as an American survivalist. No body armor, no rifle, no high caliber anything. Your best shot against the strongest version of the infected is fire launched from a wall as a last resort. That's not a tactical advantage. That's a community that's been pushed back to medieval siege logic by 28 years of isolation, fighting something that's only gotten stronger in the same amount of time. And here's the part that matters more than the gore. Jamie doesn't freeze out there. When the alpha catches up to them on the causeway, he actually shields Spike with his own body and screams for the gate to open. And it's the village watchmen who end up putting it down. So credit where it's due, the man fights. But that night, drunk at the welcome home party the village throws for Spike, Jamie tells an exaggerated version of what happened anyway. Turns his son into a giant killer. Plays the whole thing up bigger than it was. Small lie, embarrassing, not deadly. But it's the first crack, because later that same night, Spike follows his father outside and catches him sneaking off with another woman from the village, while his sick mother is lying in bed at home untreated. That's the moment Spike stops trusting the adult who's supposed to keep him alive. So now Spike's looking at his father differently, and the cracks just keep widening. His mom, Isla, has been sick for a long time, disoriented, in pain, bedbound, getting worse by the week, and Jamie won't take it seriously, won't seek real help. The next morning, Spike confronts him about it, asks him straight up about a doctor on the mainland who might be able to help her, and the conversation ends with Jamie slapping him. That's the breaking point. So Spike decides to do something most 12-year-olds in a zombie apocalypse never get the chance to do: take matters into his own hands. He convinces his sick mother to sneak off the island with him, cross the causeway, and go looking for a doctor named Kelson, who's rumored to still be out there on the mainland. Just the two of them. A dying woman and a kid walking straight into infected territory because the system back home failed them. If that doesn't sound like an all too real American story, someone driving across state lines because they can't get care where they live, I don't know what does. They don't get far before they're swarmed, and they get saved by a guy named Eric, a Swedish NATO sailor. And his story is bleaker than you'd think. Eric wasn't some longtime wasteland survivor. His patrol boat, part of the international blockade keeping Britain sealed off, hit something out in the North Sea and sank. He and a handful of his crew made it to shore on a life raft, straight into the one place on Earth nobody's allowed to leave. Most of his guys are already dead by the time he runs into Spike and Isla. So this is a man who, a few days ago, had a fiance and a phone with photos on it and a way home, and now he's trapped inside the quarantine zone he was assigned to enforce. Slowly realizing nobody's coming to pull him out, that does things to a person fast. He's rattled. He's not entirely stable, but he's resourceful. He saves them by opening fire into a building full of infected and igniting a buildup of flammable fumes, blowing the standing infected apart while Spike and Isla stay low under it. No precision shooting required, just find the flammable thing, light it off, let the blast do the work. The same logic behind any gas explosion you've ever seen on the news. Then the movie throws its biggest curveball. They find a pregnant, infected woman alone giving birth in an abandoned train car while an alpha stands guard outside like a bodyguard. Isla, despite everything, goes in and helps deliver the baby, and the baby comes out clean, not infected. Sit with how disturbing that actually is. This whole time, the working theory has been containment. Wait it out, keep the quarantine line, and eventually the virus burns itself out behind the water. But the movie suggests something that quietly torpedoes that whole plan. If an infected woman can carry a pregnancy and deliver a clean, uninfected baby, and the alpha standing guard outside seems to be protecting her while she does it, then suddenly nobody really understands what's happening behind that blockade anymore. The film doesn't spell it out, it just leaves the door open. Are the infected breeding? Was she a survivor who got infected while already pregnant? It never says. But the implication alone is enough to make 28 years of quarantine feel less like a solution and more like a pause button on something that's still quietly evolving. And just when that lands, the alpha turns on Eric and kills him in seconds. Head, spine, the whole brutal signature move. Think about that timeline. A few days ago, this guy was on a boat with a mission and a future. Now he's a trophy hanging off something that used to be a person in a country he was never supposed to set foot in. This next part is the one that actually broke people in theaters, and it's got almost nothing to do with the infected. The doctor isn't the scariest thing Spike finds out here, but for a while, it really looks like he might be. Spike, Isla, and the baby finally find Dr. Kelson, and what they find is not what you'd expect from a rescuer. Kelson lives in something he built called the Bone Temple, a massive structure made entirely out of cleaned, polished skulls. Human skulls, infected skulls, all of them stacked and arranged like a cathedral. His own private memorial to everyone who's died since the outbreak started. This is a man who's spent decades mostly alone with his grief, and at first glance it reads as deranged. Jamie, back on the island, had warned Spike about exactly this guy. Said he once watched Kelson lay out and burn hundreds of bodies and decided the man was too far gone to ever go near again. But here's the turn. The closer Spike gets, the clearer it becomes that the Skull Tower isn't the work of a monster. It's the opposite. Kelson isn't desecrating the dead. He's the only person left who's still honoring them. Every skull is someone he refused to let disappear without a marker. Survivor, infected, doesn't matter. In a world where bodies just rot in the open, this man built a temple so that death still means something. And that flips the whole thing on its head, because the guy Spike's father taught him to fear turns out to be the most humane person in the entire movie. That's worth sitting on, because it's one of the most honest things this franchise has ever said about long-term collapse. We talk a lot on this channel about prepper culture, about bunker mentality, about the guy with the underground shelter and the years of stockpiled supplies. But nobody really talks about what isolation does to how the survivors back home judge the people they've never actually met. Lindisfarne built a whole reputation around Kelson based on one frightening thing somebody saw years ago. They never got close enough to learn the truth. Fear filled in the rest. And that's exactly how good people get written off as monsters when society shrinks down to rumor and distance. And Kelson is the one who finally diagnoses what's actually wrong with Isla. It's not the virus, it's not infection at all, it's cancer, terminal, something that was always going to kill her regardless of what was happening in the trees outside Lindisfarne. And I think that's the sharpest gut punch this movie throws, because it reminds you that the apocalypse didn't cancel the rest of human suffering. Cancer's still out there. Disease is still out there. The stuff that was killing people before the rage virus never clocked out, it just got buried under a flashier threat. And Isla, lucid at the end, tells Spike something that recontextualizes the whole journey. She says she always knew she was dying. She just wanted someone else to be the one to tell him. Jamie spent the whole film trying to harden his son for a brutal world, but he never gave him the one hard truth that actually mattered. Kelson does. Isla chooses to go on her own terms, peacefully, and after she and Spike say their goodbyes, Kelson eases her out with morphine while while Spike sleeps. He cleans her skull the same way he's honored everyone else out here, and instead of recoiling from it, Spike carries it to the top of the Bone Temple himself and lays it at the summit. A 12-year-old performing his own mother's funeral rite with his own hands in the one place left in this country where death is still treated with respect. That's not a zombie kill. That's not an alpha tearing someone's spine out. That's the actual horror at the center of this whole story. That 28 years into the end of the world, the thing that finally takes someone from you might just be the same disease that would have taken them anyway in any timeline, with or without a rage virus involved. Now here's where the movie does something almost nobody saw coming, and it's the part everyone's still arguing about online. But first, Spike makes a choice. He names the baby after his mother, Isla, and instead of keeping her, he carries her back to the edge of Holy Island and leaves her at the gate with a note for his father, saying he'll come back when he's ready. Then he turns around and walks back into the mainland alone. His dad reads the note, runs out toward the water trying to follow him, and gets cut off by the rising tide. That's the last we see of that relationship. The kid chose the wasteland over the lie he grew up inside. 28 days later, Spike is out there surviving on his own, cooking a fish he caught when a pack of infected corners him. No backup, no dad, no mom, just him against a swarm, and it looks like the end. And then, out of nowhere, a gang of survivors shows up wearing matching colored tracksuits and bleach blonde wigs, fighting in synchronized parkour, wiping out the infected like it's a choreographed routine. Their leader is a grown man named Jimmy. If that tone shift feels jarring, that's the point. This appears to be the same Jimmy from the very first scene of the movie. The little boy whose preacher father interpreted the outbreak as the second coming and let the infected take him in the church as an act of religious surrender, handing his son a crucifix on the way out. The film strongly implies that Boy grew up into this, and he didn't grow up into a broken survivor. He grew up into something that looks a lot like a cult leader, styled in a way that deliberately echoes a disgraced British TV personality, wearing that same crucifix now turned upside down, leading a tribe that treats killing the infected like performance art. He extends a hand to Spike, offers him a family, a place in the group, and the movie just ends there. No resolution, no clean wrap-up. Just Spike, framed between two completely different futures. Go with the kid he barely knows who's built a violent little empire out of his own childhood trauma, or walk into the unknown alone. Here's what that ending seems to be getting at. Underneath all the color and chaos, the real long-term threat in a collapse like this was never just the infected. It's what people can become after enough years of trauma with no real authority left to answer to. Jimmy doesn't read as dangerous because he's strong. He reads as dangerous because he's charismatic, clearly damaged, and appears to have built something close to a faith out of survival. The movie deliberately leaves it open. We don't fully know what these people are yet, but the unease is the whole point, and it's a sharper note to end on than any zombie this franchise has put on screen. So if you're actually trying to figure out how you'd make it through something like this, the real lessons aren't about bow draw weight or which gas station still has supplies. It's about timing the tide before you trust the ground under your feet. It's about not writing off the doctor everyone told you was a monster, because fear and distance turn rumors into facts when the world gets small. It's about understanding that disease and grief don't pause just because there's a louder threat out in the woods, and it's about being honest with the people counting on you, because the gap between who Jamie pretended to be and who he actually was did more damage to that family than any alpha ever could. 28 years in, the water still doesn't care if you're paying attention. Neither does the cancer. Neither does the guy in the tracksuit with a cross around his neck and a story he's been telling himself since he was a kid. That's the world this franchise built, and it's coming back for at least one more round with Bone Temple already waiting in the wings. If you made it this far, you already know what kind of channel this is. There's a whole library of these breakdowns waiting for you. Go pick the next one.